back in session, and we once again given the floor to Nguyen Chi's defense to continue presenting their closing statement. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shall need another half hour to finish my introductory remarks. And before the break, I was speaking about Mr. Hedder. And I was saying before the break that no one doubts Mr. Hedder's credential as an academic and a researcher. Yet as a participant in this process and a witness before this chamber, there are serious questions in need of answers. Any court truly concerned with the reliability of the evidence before it would demand clear and detailed explanations concerning the nature and extent of Mr. Hedder's role in the introductory submissions and the judicial investigation that followed. In light of Mr. Hedder's extraordinary influence over these proceedings, any court, I said that earlier before the break, concerned with ascertaining the truth would be especially motivated to probe the foundations of his conclusions. Yet, this chamber actively sought to find out as little as possible. Even though Mr. Hedder was present in this courtroom and prepared to testify, the chamber prohibited any questions of any kind about the investigation. The chamber prohibited any questions concerning the methodology Mr. Hedder used to arrive at his conclusion. The chamber did not hold that these questions were not probative. It did not hold that these questions were not relevant. Instead, Mr. President, the chamber held that these questions were inadmissible just because they concerned the investigation. And as you know, Mr. President, this exchange caused so serious a violation of our client's right to a fair trial that it prompted Nguyen Chi to retract his decision to resume testimony. I'd like now to come back to something I have touched upon twice: the government's continued interference with the work of the tribunal. And I made reference to this during my introductory remarks. I explained, as you have many times before, why the government's interference bears directly on our client's right to a fair trial. I elaborated on that in explaining that government interference has directly impacted Nguyen Chi's ability to hear exculpatory evidence. And this interference began at the tribunal's inception, and it continues to this day. It is well documented and undeniable. It includes 1, the effort of government officials to prevent the appearance of the late King Father Norodom Sihanouk as a witness. 2, the failure of 6 high-ranking government officials to appear before the co-investigating judges pursuant to validly issued summonses, and the role of Prime Minister Hun Sen and other members of the government therein. And 3rd, the Prime Minister's effort, aided and abetted by various members of the government, to thwart cases 3 and 4. And the defense has also raised concerns regarding the complicity of the National Co-Prosecutor and Co-Investigating Judge Yu Buleng, and has formally called upon Judge Buleng to resign. If any doubt of the government's interference could possibly have existed, it was extinguished with Judge Casper Ansermet's resignation from this court. His departure was accompanied by a 10-page note detailing the government's persistent interference in his work at the tribunal. As Judge Casper Ansermet stated, and I quote, "There exists within the ECCC such serious irregularities, dysfunctions, and violations of proper procedures that endanger and impede due process of law." End of quote. This evidence of interference was so clear that it prompted consistent commentary and concern from the international community. The Open Society Justice Initiative and other veteran tribunal monitors called for the United Nations and donors to seriously examine the institutional damage caused by government interference and reconsider its commitment to the tribunal. In addition to causing a per se violation of our client's right to a fair trial and preventing him from hearing crucial exculpatory evidence, the influence of the government over proceedings at the ECCC has caused direct prejudice to Nuon Chea. From the start of the Case 002 proceedings, officials and agents of the government have improperly voiced their opinion on the guilt of the accused. In January 2012, at an international press conference, Prime Minister Hun Sen publicly announced that our client was deceitful, a killer, and a perpetrator of genocide. Words echoed before this chamber by the co-prosecutors over the past 3 days. The defense immediately requested the trial chamber to publicly condemn the Prime Minister's characterization of our client as a génocidaire and demand that he refrain from making such comments in the future. As such, commentary violated our client's fundamental right to a presumption of innocence. And Mr. President, instead of taking active steps to remedy that bias, the trial chamber did what it does best, in our view, answered our request with silence, allowing the Prime Minister's comments to fester. And over a week later, the trial chamber stated that it preferred, and I quote, that it preferred not to make any comment to react, unquote. Another week later, the trial chamber still refused to publicly condemn the Prime Minister's assertions of our client's guilt. All the while, Prime Minister Hun Sen continued to publicly state his belief in Nuon Chea's guilt. And the defense was again frustrated by the trial chamber when it sought to bring to public attention statements prejudicial to our client by Minister of Foreign Affairs Hor Nam Hong. The chamber cut off counsel's microphone and ruled that the issue could be raised only in written form. In response to our written request, the chamber refused to investigate the effect of Hor Nam Hong's statements on witnesses appearing before the chamber. And incredibly, this chamber continued to refuse even after a witness recanted his prior testimony in an apparent direct reaction to Hor Nam Hong's intimidation. Yet the trial chamber, like the co-investigating judges and the pre-trial chamber before it, declined to take any remedial action. And with each additional manifestation, Nuon Chea's right to a presumption of innocence and his right to be tried by an independent and impartial tribunal were eroded until nothing left remains. Mr. President, Your Honours, this concludes our discussion of the numerous procedural failures of this trial. And before I hand the floor to my Cambodian colleague Sonarun, to take up our client's background and role in the Cambodian Socialist Revolution, I have some concluding remarks about the legitimacy of this tribunal. These remarks reflect, in part, what we said in our brief last month. But the urgency of making these comments in public before this chamber became increasingly apparent as the co-prosecutor's submissions progressed over the last 3 days. And especially yesterday, as the intensity of their rhetoric grew to an angry fever pitch. The co-prosecutors began their presentation on Thursday morning by assuring the chamber that this trial is not about communism. They told us that neither communism nor socialism nor any other political system or philosophy is on trial before this court. And yet what we saw from the co-prosecutors, and especially the international co-prosecutor, can only be described as an all-out ideological attack, an assault against communism for communism's sake. If this trial were, as the co-prosecutors claim, only about crimes, then what we heard over the past 3 days would have focused on facts. The prosecution would have shown us the proof of Nuon Chia's intent to execute Lon Nol soldiers. They would have shown us the proof that our client intended to exterminate the population of Phnom Penh. Instead, Mr. President, what we got from the co-prosecutors was their most impassioned effort to delegitimize the CPK, to persuade this chamber that the CPK was not a political movement but a criminal one, to establish, contrary to every shred of the evidence, that the CPK was not trying to institute economic policies they genuinely believed in, but instead to repeat the words slave and enslavement over and over and over again. We ask this chamber to consider the question, why did the co-prosecutors feel it necessary to say the word slave so many times? The law requires something much simpler. The law requires proof that our client acted with the intent to commit acts considered criminal by the law of this tribunal. If evidence of that intent exists, the co-prosecutors ought to have simply presented that evidence and proven Nuon Chia's criminal liability. Instead, they tried to do something much larger. They tried to persuade this chamber the CPK's purpose was criminal. And as we have seen, this is a claim that not even the investigating judges made in the closing order. And it's not even a claim that the co-prosecutors themselves made in their final submissions after the closing of the investigation. Mr. President, the international co-prosecutor spoke of winners and losers. We too agree that there are winners and losers. The winners were firstly the United States and its allies. The Americans won an ideological war, their war against communism. And the winners were secondly the current leaders of the Cambodian government. The leaders of the current government won a war for control over Cambodia. A war which began within the CPK, quite possibly in the earliest days of democratic Kampuchea, and continued in military form until the CPK capitulated in 1998. Now, what do these two seemingly very different groups have in common? What they have in common is an interest in ensuring that the history of Cambodia punishes the Cambodian communists as harshly as possible. For the Americans and their allies, punishing the Cambodian communists vindicates the fundamental justice of the last half-century of their foreign policy. It absolves them of the horrific crimes they themselves committed in the interest of protecting the free world against those communists. For the leaders of the Cambodian government, punishing Cambodian communists justifies the legitimacy of their original claim to power. Indeed, it justifies their continuing claim to power, as the Prime Minister's warnings of civil unrest, were any other party to win power, continually prove. For these reasons, international criminal justice has a long tradition of prosecuting all sides of a conflict. A trial that focuses on the crimes of only one party to a conflict and not the other can never be free of the suspicion that they are being used as a tool of political power. Such a trial could never be free of the suspicion that they are being used as a method of confirming one side limited, even if genuinely held, narrative of history. At no international criminal trial were these concerns more acute than the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, better known as the Tokyo Tribunal. Writing in dissent, Justice Paul from India recognized that a trial which does not correspond to any idea of justice could only amount to formalized vengeance. And Justice Paul further explained, and I quote, "It does not quite comply with the idea of international justice that only the vanquished states are obliged to surrender their own subjects to the jurisdiction of an international tribunal for the punishment of war crimes. The victorious states, too, should be willing to transfer their jurisdiction over their own subjects who have offended the laws of warfare to the same independent and impartial international tribunal." End of quote. Observers who reflected on the Tokyo Tribunal in later years consistently chastised the tribunal for its numerous procedural and structural defects. Richard Minier, in his book Victor's Justice, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, criticized the tribunal for the fact that, and I quote, "all the justice at the Tokyo Tribunal came from the victor nations." End of quote. Defense counsel there argued that, and I quote, "regardless of the known integrity of the individual members of this tribunal, they cannot, under the circumstances of their appointment, be impartial. Under the circumstances, this trial, both in the present day and in history, will never be free from substantial doubt as to its legality, fairness, and impartiality." End of quote. Richard Minier, in his book Victor's Justice, concludes that the appointment of justices from among only the aggrieved and victor nations, quote, "raises serious questions about the tribunal's impartiality." End of quote. Now, these criticisms, Mr. President, apply equally to the ECCC, where cases have been and are adjudicated almost entirely by nationals of the victor nations. The hybrid character of the tribunal reflects the victorious parties almost perfectly. The CPK cadres turned CPP leaders, whose influence over national side judges is pervasive, and the nationals of the United States, France, and their closest allies who do, and always, have populated the international side. Like the Tokyo Tribunal, it is inconceivable that a group of judges, born, raised, and schooled in capitalist societies, could ever, no matter what their individual integrity, impartially judge the lawfulness of communist collectivist policy. We remind the Chamber that it is exactly the co-prosecutor's position that the CPK's decision to adopt the collectivist economic system through the formation of cooperatives was criminal as such. They say that collectivization is unlawful as such. That collectivization through cooperatives was an inherently criminal policy. The co-prosecutors accused the CPK of abolishing markets. Can they explain to the Chamber what a collectivist economy would look like that they would not consider unlawful? How the CPK could have instituted collectivist economic policy without committing crimes against humanity as such? It is apparent to anyone, or should be, that judges reared in and loyal to a communist society, where the absence of market is normal and usual, where economic freedoms as we understand them do not exist, where the Communist Party is the manifestation of the state, would approach and answer these questions very differently than the judges on the bench sitting here today. Now, Mr. President, the point is not to impugn the integrity of the bench. It is not to attack its moral character. The point is to ask, how can your honors, each loyal to a worldview fundamentally incompatible with every aspect of the CPK's political project, impartially adjudicate crimes explicitly rooted in the policies adopted for the purpose of implementing that project? We respectfully submit, Mr. President, the answer is you cannot. The Chamber's inability to possess an alternative interpretation of history is apparent in its selective approach to the selection of witnesses and experts in the course of this trial. By hearing only those experts who see the democratic Kampuchea period through roughly the same lens as they do, as you do, the Chamber has wrapped itself in and continued to propagate an Anglo-French narrative that represents and reinforces the perspective of the victor nations. Nguyen Chia can prove to this Chamber that he was not trying to enslave or exterminate, only if he can make this Chamber understand what it is he was trying to do. That seems unlikely at the tribunal presided over and informed by people intrinsically hostile to his entire project. People who think that collectivization is a criminal offense. Only a tribunal willing to take a different, or at least broader perspective, could afford to our client a fair trial. Only a tribunal capable of seeing that the actions of a wide range of other actors must be called to account could be trusted to assess Nguyen Chia's conduct impartially and not merely for the purpose of winning ideological or political battles. Any other tribunal could offer only the basest form of victor's justice. It's for all of these reasons, Mr. President, that our client has consistently demanded that the jurisdiction of this tribunal canvass a far broader scope of events, that the limits on the tribunal's jurisdiction were sure to distort its work and hinder its effort to ascertain the truth. You will remember Nguyen Chia's first words to the trial chamber. They were, and I quote, "I am of the opinion that this court is unfair to me since the beginning, because only certain facts are to be adjudicated by this court. I must say, only the body of the crocodile is to be discussed, not its head or the tails, which are the important part of its daily activities. All it means, the root cause and its consequences are those that happened pre-75 and post-79 are ignored by this court." End of quote. Only if the head and the tail of the crocodile are given their due consideration can the Chamber understand just how misguided and dishonest the co-prosecutors have been over the last 3 days. Only if the Chamber sees the larger context of our client's decision and the policies the CPK adopted can it understand that Nguyen Chia did not intend to create a slave state in democratic Kampuchea. That he is not a deceitful killer that the co-prosecutors, taking their cue from the Prime Minister, believe that he is. Mr. President, Your Honours, to show the Chamber the head and tail of the crocodile, I would like now to pass the floor to my colleague, Sonarun.
Thank you, Mr. Victor Kope. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors, and good morning to everyone. I am Sonarun. I am a National Counsel for the Defense Team of Nuon Chea. I would like to continue from my esteemed colleague, Mr. Victor Kope, International Counsel for Mr. Nuon Chea. And now I will continue this closing statement as follows. Mr. President, first, in my submission, I am going to present you the reason why Mr. Nuon Chea was keen to involve in revolution. I am going to discuss it in 2 points. One is the reason why he joined the revolution in the first place and his contribution to these revolutionary efforts. As a young man, Mr. Nuon Chea was heartbroken by the oppression of ordinary Cambodians by the French. He saw the plight of the poor and he was appalled. These experiences created a deep-set desire within him to free Cambodia and the Cambodian people from foreign exploitation and the oppressive networks of power and control. Mr. Nuon Chea believed firmly that communism was Cambodia's antidote to these ills. For Nuon Chea, the crucial issues such as French colonialism, the long history of Thai and Vietnamese aggression, and the acute destruction wrought by American imperialism are parts of the head and the tail of the crocodile. They are not simply the theoretical topics meant for an academic discussion. To Nuon Chea, they were realities that resulted in Cambodia's entrenched poverty, poverty caused by class oppression and supported by violent and opportunistic foreign intervention. The suffering of Cambodians under colonial control stirred Nuon Chea. The people were powerless. They were exploited by the French. French authorities demanded taxes from impoverished peasants on threat of violence, all the while securing their own privileged access to raw materials. Raw materials that rightfully belonged to the Cambodian people. While the French claimed to be administering Cambodia for the benefit of ordinary Cambodians, in reality, their policies ensured that the masses remain docile and French profits remain high. The French gave nothing in return to the Cambodian people. Education and medical services were ignored, and electricity and running water did not exist outside Phnom Penh. Over time, Nuon Chea came to understand that these inequities were not limited to the relatively brief period of French control. He realized that French colonialism had merely interrupted centuries of domination by Cambodia's larger neighbors. For hundreds of years, Siem and various kingdoms that now occupy modern-day Vietnam fought for control over and occupied large sections of modern Cambodian state. With few exceptions, Cambodian leaders were shameless collaborators in these cycles of exploitation. Prince Sihanouk's effort after 1953 to present the Sangkum Risniyum as an authentically Cambodian government leading a newly liberated state was in substance no different. Fundamentally, Sihanouk's regime was as unconcerned with the lives and the livelihoods of the overwhelming majority of Cambodians as the French had been before him. Nuon Chea knew some things had to change. He first tried to effect change within the system politically. Yet he quickly learned that those who tried to resist the government were arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to violence and brutality. He learned that under Prince Sihanouk's authority, Lonol oppressed the Cambodian people and the peasant at his will. Finally, after many years of repression of the socialist peaceful activities, the CPK adopted an armed struggle. In 1962, cadres armed themselves with stakes and knives in self-defense against the violence perpetrated by Lonol's forces. Following the spontaneous 1967 peasant revolt in Somlot, Lonol dispatched thousands of soldiers to suppress the peasants. The victims of this violence and the children of those who were killed took it upon themselves to fight back. On the morning of the 17th of January 1968, the small group raided the police station in Bai Dam Ram and stole 7 weapons. As a result of that event, the armed struggle spread from one location to the next, and the socialist revolution of the Communist Party of Cambodia began. It was largely these domestic issues that motivated Cambodian socialism, but it was the Vietnamese fight for independence and the Americans' disastrous involvement in it that pushed the young Cambodian liberation movement to the forefront of the global struggle of oppressed peoples against foreign domination. Over nearly 2 decades, the United States government had employed overwhelming military, economic, and political violence against communists in neighboring Vietnam, then the CPK's closest comrades in arms. The conflict extended into Cambodian territory as early as 1965. It escalated in 1969 before reaching a level of unprecedented destruction over 8 unrelenting months in 1973. Altogether, the Americans dropped 2,756,941 tons of bombs on Cambodia. That is more than the total used by all the Allied forces combined during the entirety of World War II, including the nuclear bombs that struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The CPK alone lost an estimated 16,000 men and women. Mr. Nguyen Chia learned from decades of experience that anyone seeking to elevate the status of the rural poor would be subject to swift and violent retaliation. He understood that foreign states would never have the interest of ordinary Cambodians at heart. Nguyen Chia and his comrades decided that the only path to justice and prosperity lay in an independent and authentically Cambodian state. Nguyen Chia genuinely believed that communism was a path to this freedom. He believed that through communism, a modern and independent Cambodian state capable of providing for its citizens could be reached. This idea was neither far-fetched nor unreasonable. By the time Nguyen Chia joined the Thai Communist Party in 1951, at least 12 states, representing nearly a third of the world's population, had adopted some form of socialist government. In Asia, the continent's two superpowers, Russia and China, had already adopted socialist forms of government. Both of Cambodia's immediate and much more powerful neighbors had active communist movements. The North Vietnamese Communist Revolution and its War of Liberation were one and the same. By bringing communism to the people of Cambodia, the CPK hoped to abolish unjust political and economic systems. They never wanted to mistreat ordinary civilians. They sought to establish an equitable society, not sacrifice the rich to the poor. They wanted to make Cambodia strong and independent, not isolationist and reclusive. The CPK hoped to liberate the Cambodian people from the forces of colonialism, imperialism, and feudalism. Both the theory and practice of the Cambodian Socialist Revolution reflected that strategy. Determining the intent behind CPK policy requires an understanding of the revolutionary language employed by the CPK as a matter of ordinary discourse. Francois Ponceau is correct that the CPK adopted new linguistic forms not typical to pre-revolutionary Khmer. That language was distinctive precisely in its use for warlike metaphors to describe the most ordinary task. Cadres were urged to launch mighty offensives, attack, and liven the combat line against the rice harvest and the planting season. The Standing Committee employed similar language even in their own internal discussion. The same language was used to describe the CPK's efforts to promote adherence to its political goals. Viewed in light of the CPK's metaphorical use of violent language, the CPK document instructing cadres to attack or smash capitalists, feudalists, imperialists, and imperialists can only be given the same interpretation. These documents frequently describe the importance of smashing the structure of capitalism and feudalism. One indication of the CPK focus on systems rather than people can be seen in the co-prosecutor's effort to mischaracterize documents which, on their face, say nothing at all about enemies. In one instance, the co-prosecutors read an excerpt concerning the effort to smash, quote and unquote, class, regime, and ideology, and then summarize the document as an instruction to smash these people and their class and their regime and their ideology. If real evidence of the party center's intention to smash people existed, the co-prosecutor would have preferred those documents rather than inserting words that did not exist into the documents they did present. The CPK never sought to build socialism through the use of violence. The October 1975 issue of Revolutionary Youth shows this. The Communist Party of Cambodia instruct cadres to continue class combat against the feudalists and capitalists in the ranks of the workers in the cooperatives, and specifically states that, and I quote, the class struggle in this new revolutionary period does not take the form of armed violence, a revolutionary war, or bloodletting combat, and unquote. For Nuon Chea and the CPK, defending the socialist revolution post-liberation had two principal components. They were education and dismantling the networks of power of the oppressive classes. Violence was never one of them. The December 1972 issue of Revolutionary Flag explains that bourgeoisie attitudes in the party should be eliminated through a process of workerization of the party in terms of their psychological stance. The September 1974 issue of Revolutionary Youth instructs cadres to educate youth to see the oppression of the land owners class and seek to liberate itself from imperialist ideology. The August 1975 issue of Revolutionary Youth explains that vigilance against the enemy requires a strong military presence at the border, together with political education and a proletariat stance. Philip Short is correct in his conclusion that Cambodian socialism was distinctive in its belief that class consciousness was not immutable and could be constructed through education and a proletarian lifestyle. The elimination of networks of power, the essence of a fight against systems and not people, is equally clear. The October 1976 issue of Revolutionary Flag explains, I quote, "Closing remarks in 1972 was no minor matter. It was a very mighty revolutionary movement that struck right at the economic foundations of the capitalists and the feudalists. We did not use military force to kill them. We got control of the important products like rice, oil, salt, cloth, and medicine. When we were able to control the strategic products, we gained control over the entire economy," unquote. Thus, where socialism functions properly as an economic and political system, opposing ideologies are not needed or desired. Within the context of this overt socialist struggle, Nuon Chea finds himself perplexed by the co-prosecutor's persistent effort to prove that an entity which called itself the Communist Party of Cambodia was engaged in class struggle. Nuon Chea wonders in what other kinds of struggle workers of the world would be expected to unite. These efforts confirmed Nuon Chea's deeply held suspicion that he is being tried not for crimes but for communism, for beliefs and not for conduct. The only question of potential relevance for this chamber is not whether CPK philosophy was based in part on class theory. The only question of relevance is whether it intended to mistreat a legally cognizable group. The answer is no. As Nuon Chea has explained before this chamber, the CPK never believed that peasant workers were in contradiction with any other class as such. Even groups at the very top of the feudalist class, such as the royal family, included nationalists who supported the people and the revolution. Certainly, it was not the case that those in the feudalist regime, including petty officials, commune chief, and clerks, were in contradiction with the peasants. With the exception of imperialists, no group was an enemy of the party. That conclusion followed from both the CPK's class analysis and the imperatives of the revolution, which needed to reduce enemies, increase friends. Summarizing the CPK's position, Nuon Chea explained, and I quote, "Apart from those people who were committed to ruining the country, who were the foreign henchmen or imperialist henchmen, they were all good people," unquote. Likewise, petty bourgeoisie, intellectuals, and students were not enemies of the CPK, and they were viewed by the CPK as quote-unquote allies of the peasant workers that love revolution. The CPK believed that national-level capitalists were, quote, the strategic supporting force of the democratic national revolution, unquote. These classes were viewed as united because as Cambodians, they all lived under threat of the colonialists and imperialists. Quote, "Any class whatsoever in the framework of an enslaved country or semi-enslaved country has their national souls damaged, whether a little or a lot, unquote. Ok Bun-chuen told Steve Hader that Pol Pot's policy emphasized the manner in which, quote, middle-class farmers, upper-class farmers, petty bourgeoisie, monks, intellectuals, unquote, were all oppressed by the old society. Neither was there any animosity towards city dwellers in general or those living in Phnom Penh in April 1975. Khieu Sampon's broadcasts in the months prior to liberation urged our brother countrymen in Phnom Penh to rise up against their oppressor. An October 1975 issue of the Revolutionary Youth describes the efforts of the cooperatives to feed and support more than 2 million people who have just been liberated from the rule of the contemptible traitors. If the people in Phnom Penh had themselves been enemies, there would have been no sense describing their liberation. Numerous witnesses testify that no distinction was made between base people and new people. Non Suan, a senior CPK official, told Steve Hader that he was instructed in his sector, quote, to prepare food, water, lodging for the evacuees, to slaughter animals, to feed them, and give them co-op rice, unquote. Nuon Chea similarly told Tet Sambat that, quote, we always advise our cadres to take care of the new people and to make them equal. Even though they are 17 April people, they still had the right to work in the cooperative, unquote. As a socialist movement, the CPK did, of course, attempt to eliminate the position of privilege that had been previously enjoyed by the feudalist and capitalist classes. But that policy was not discrimination. It only required that all Cambodians be afforded the same privileges and obligations irrespective of class. Hence, the unjust influence of the feudalist landowners was diminished by, quote, reducing their rice paddy to as little as the other peasants have, unquote, and they were to be treated the same way as everyone else. The CPK's analysis of Cambodia's history of colonialism, feudalism, and imperialism identified a clear link between foreign political control of the state and the economic plight of the poor. Khieu Sampon's doctoral dissertation advocated for self-sufficiency as a central pillar of his plan to improve the lives of the peasantry. Mr. Nuon Chea recalls that as a student in Bangkok in the late 1940s, he observed that Thailand was not truly independent because the economy was dominated by foreign interests and the poor were oppressed by the wealthy. Mr. Nguyen Chia articulated this idea during his testimony before the chamber in the language which the CPK would years later adopt to express it. I quote, "The true nature of this Cambodian society is half colonial, half feudalism. Therefore, the task of the revolution of the democratic Cambodia at that time is to eliminate the remnants of the half colonialism, half feudalism, and to oppose and resist the half capitalism. It means to liberate the nation and the people. To liberate the nation means to eliminate remnants of the colonialism at that time and to gradually eliminate the feudalists." Unquote. The end of military hostilities in 1975, even if the CPK could have been expected to believe that hostilities had indeed terminated, did not mean that a further threat of foreign intervention no longer existed. The CPK was acutely aware of the ability of powerful states to use non-military means, including diplomacy and foreign aid, to exercise their will over weaker states. Although the CPK was wary of foreign involvement, this distrust never resulted in the near total isolation of Cambodia from the rest of the world. Nor was it rooted in an abstract ideological fixation on self-reliance. Foreign aid was freely accepted when it was not intended as a tool for the manipulation of domestic Cambodian policy. Nguyen Chia explains that aid from China was without any string attached, meaning that it was offered without condition. Aid from other friendly states was also often accepted. Only when it was conditional was aid rejected. The CPK never refused all foreign aid and assistance, as the co-investigating judges and the co-prosecutors alleged that various documents show. Included within these documents are 3 secondary sources, newspaper articles that make vague, unsubstantiated declaration that the CPK shunned foreign aid and failed to support these claims with any specificity. Another document characterizes the CPK's refusal of an offer by French embassy to loan 1 teacher and a few medics to the new government as a denial of quote and unquote foreign aid. Other documents indicate that the issue of whether foreign aid was actually accepted was unknown, while 2 others remained silent on the matter completely. Others highlight the CPK's goal of self-sufficiency, but none come close to establishing a blanket refusal to accept outside aid. Mr. President, I look at the clock and it's now well over 12. I don't know whether or not I should pause here. I have a few more pages to go, Mr. President. The President. Thank you, Council. The time is now appropriate for lunch adjournment. The Chamber shall adjourn now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. This is the notice for the parties and support staff to the Chamber. For your preparation, security guards are instructed to bring Mr. Kilsampon to the holding cell downstairs and have him return to this courtroom this afternoon before 1:30. The court is now adjourned.
សូមក្រោកឈរ